This is the first real outing that I've had since all this lockdown stuff. And so I'm very happy to be here. This lecture is designed to sort of keep things going. The blockade is perhaps the most famous naval subject in the history of the United States. It's very much maritime history, which is what the National Lighthouse Museum is all about. I thought that a series of lectures on the blockade would be something that'll kind of keep the light going this summer. Hello, my name is Wade Goria, and I'm an historian and the lecturer for the National Lighthouse Museum. And I'm happy to welcome you to this presentation entitled The Union Blockade During the American Civil War. Let's give a little background about this program. Normally, we might have a lot of people sitting here. If I were giving a lecture or anyone else visiting the National Lighthouse Museum were giving a lecture, but we're living during a COVID-19 pandemic, and that's just not possible. But we want to keep our programs going at the National Lighthouse Museum, and so the idea came about to give a lecture that you'd be able to attend, and it's going to be a lecture, of course, that's very much related to maritime history, which is very much a theme of the National Lighthouse Museum. And it's the first time I've given a lecture on the Union blockade for a very long time. I taught history and international relations at New York University for 18 years, and my specialty was modern Middle Eastern history. But when I was an undergraduate at Brooklyn College, I studied under Hans Traefus, a great historian who passed away about 10 years ago, who lived in Staten Island. We became great friends. And I did a senior honors thesis on the lag in U.S. naval development between 1844 and 1862 that helped me get into Oxford. And what we're looking at today will be part of that research, and then what I'd like to do in this lecture is to enable you to understand many of the different aspects of the blockade. Naturally, we're going to be talking about some of the most important battles, but I'd like you to have a working knowledge of the geography of the United States. And that includes port cities extending from Hampton Roads, Virginia, all the way to Galveston, Texas. I'd like you to know some of the key rivers that were involved in the warfare that took place on the water during the American Civil War. And I'd like you to have a good idea about who the key players were during the 4-year Civil War, and of course with particular emphasis on the Union blockade of the South. Now I'd like to start this presentation with showing you a image of the great explosion on the USS Princeton that took place on February 28, 1844. And it was an explosion that took place in a gun that was known as the Peacemaker. This was a terrible catastrophe for the U.S. Navy. We had Secretary of State Abel P. Upshur was killed. Thomas Walker Gilder, who was also in the cabinet as Naval Secretary, was killed. David Gardner, who was the father of Julia Gardner, the wife of President Tyler, was killed. He was a senator at the time. And all together there were people killed and 20 people seriously injured. President Tyler was on the lower deck at the time of this explosion, and so he missed being killed. Now, why do I start with this incident? My research led me to believe that this explosion really led to a lag in U.S. naval development between 1844 and 1862, when the Monitor battled the Merrimack on March the 9th, 1862. The importance of this is very much that the explosion was so horrific that the inventor of the Princeton, John Erickson, received a great deal of blame for what happened. And consequently, there was an attending lag in U.S. naval development. In fact, some people felt that steamships such as the Princeton, which was a marvelous, very modern design that was so innovative for 1844, that after that, people began to have a lot of suspicion about steam navies and the types of weaponry that were used at that time. And Erickson got a lot of the blame. Well, Erickson did not build the gun called the Peacemaker. He built a gun called the Oregon, which did not misfire. The person who arranged to have that built was Stockton, a naval man who ended up blaming John Erickson for that disaster. For 17 years, Erickson really didn't want to have anything to do with the Naval Department. And as a result, the U.S. Navy really was not that modern at the outbreak of the Civil War. So we look at the Princeton as a time during the presidency of John Tyler when the United States was really headed in a very modern direction and things slowed up. It's a little bit reminiscent of the Hindenburg disaster, which pretty much killed the use of dirigibles for air travel after that terrible disaster that took place in New Jersey. And so Princeton itself was so modern and so innovative, and the United States should have progressed, but it really didn't. Now, my thesis at the time also argued that the U.S. Navy was very corrupt. It had a lot of people who were not particularly qualified to make important decisions regarding our naval welfare. And the shipyards, such as in Philadelphia and in Norfolk and the Brooklyn Naval Yard, were very corrupt places where things just weren't happening the way they should have happened. So a very, very important man in American history who is going to outline a plan for the defeat of the Confederacy, which he calls the Anaconda Plan. It's a blockade plan. I'd like to give you a little background about Winfield Scott. Lots of people have heard the term Old Fuss and Feathers, a nickname of his, or the Grand Old Man of the Army. He fought in the War of 1812, the Black Hawk War, the Second Seminole War, Creek War, and the Mexican War. In 1841, he became the first lieutenant general in the Army since George Washington. He was very, very distinguished and extremely well appreciated by the American people. He ran for the presidency in 1852. That didn't work out. The dark horse candidate, Franklin Pierce, ended up winning the nomination, winning the presidency against Scott, who was a Whig candidate. Now, we see Scott here at the Battle of Veracruz, and this has great relevance for our blockade, because Scott used many of the same ideas in Mexico in order to complete the conquest of Mexico. He used many of the same ideas on the Confederacy to choke the Confederacy via its blockade. You can see that Scott is quite young and dashing here, or at least I think he was older than he looks in this picture, but he still had a very kind of daring look, and you see this is probably more accurate of the way he looked when he is able to effect the conquest of Mexico City. When we sing the Marine song, from the holes of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli, Montezuma is the Aztec emperor who is referred to with the United States effecting this amazing conquest of Mexico. Now, the people who participated in the Mexican War, along with Winfield Scott, Robert E. Lee, who Winfield Scott considered to be the greatest field commander he had ever witnessed. Ulysses S. Grant was at the Mexican War. Longstreet, all the great generals, many of them had participated in the Mexican War, and that becomes a sort of rehearsal for the United States conquest of the Confederacy. The Anaconda Plan. The anaconda is a snake that is prevalent in South Asia. We've never seen evidence to this effect, but apparently anacondas have been, let's put it this way, there have been claims that an anaconda can actually eat a man, but there's no proof that's ever been provided to that effect. Anacondas are very powerful, and they will strangle you to death. They became well known in the 19th century, and so the use of the term anaconda was certainly relevant for Scott as he looked at the Confederacy. He wanted to choke the Confederacy to prevent supplies from coming into the ports and eventually lead to the submission of the Confederacy. Here's the quote. He said, Scott once declared that Lee was the very best soldier that I ever saw in the field. He recommended that Lee assume command of the Army of the Potomac, but Lee refused to take up arms against his native state of Virginia. And Scott told Lee after a meeting that Lee had with Montgomery Blair, the postmaster, who was an advisor to Lincoln, and with General Scott, he said, Lee, you have made the greatest mistake of your life, but I feared it would be so. He said that on April 18th, the date of their famous meeting. Now, I have a photograph here of cotton, and I think in your social studies classes in high school, you learned about King Cotton. It's probably a good idea to remind everybody about the unbelievable importance of cotton to the economy, not only of the Confederacy, or I should say the southern states, but of the United States. America's most successful export. It supplied 75% of the world's cotton. This cotton was provided from ports in New Orleans, Houston, Charleston, Mobile, Savannah, and a few other smaller ports. It supplied 60% of all of the exports of the United States. Now, the Union blockade would succeed in preventing 95% of cotton from leaving southern ports. Britain would never intervene. 1/4 of Britain's foodstuff came from America, and the British were not very enthused about the idea of supporting the South because they knew that it would be dangerous for them. They had outlawed slavery, and the idea that Britain would support the Confederacy over the Union, supporting slavery over freedom, was something that I think would be hard to explain to the British public. Nevertheless, I think one should keep in mind that the British could be very duplicitous. And the British were always looking to undermine the United States, just as they did in the War of 1812. And if there was an opportunity available for the British to take advantage of this great civil war and reduce the power of the United States by half, well, it would be fishing in muddy waters. So it doesn't come out against the Union. It doesn't come out against the Confederacy. It's not until the Battle of Antietam in September of 1862 that I think the British are going to say, we cannot support the South. Soon after Antietam, Lincoln initiates his Emancipation Proclamation, which is, of course, going to focus on the goal of the emancipation of slaves, along with the preservation of the Union. Again, the British or French would find it very hard to support the Confederacy after that. This is a cartoon which I think is a very kind of useful cartoon to get a few concepts in mind. Little Bo Peep and Her Foolish Sheep. And James Buchanan, who was the 15th president of the United States before Lincoln, whose policy was pretty much to do nothing as the Civil War states seceded. And South Carolina, followed by Mississippi and Alabama. And so what you see is a situation here of chaos. And there was a very strong feeling at the time that Buchanan really could have done more. Now, he was in a very difficult position, and there isn't time here to go into all the details. But I think it's important to keep in mind that he was in a terrible position. And the southern states had gotten to a point where they simply wanted out of the United States. And rather than attack these states, he was letting secession take place. Many people had looked to Andrew Jackson's policy in 1828 when John C. Calhoun called for secession of South Carolina as a result of what he called the Tariff of Abomination. And Jackson said, and he really had John C. Calhoun in mind, that I will round up these traitors and hang them from the highest gibbet. Now, the gibbet was a terrible device that not only allowed people to hang, but dangle there for months after they had been hanged. And so Jackson played very tough against the South in 1828, which is what a lot of people felt was needed. Buchanan did much of nothing. I have a picture of a riverboat here, and it shows both Vicksburg and Natchez. And my reason for showing you this is that there's generally an idea that the South was a good deal more uniform in its opposition to the Union than was actually the case. If we take an example of a deep South state like Mississippi, we see that Natchez and Vicksburg, which benefited tremendously from the cotton trade, that they tended to be also quite pro-unionist in sentiment, or at least neutral. And so this idea that everybody joined the South, I mean, we have areas of Western Virginia, which today is West Virginia, where they were not interested in secession. We have the northern part of Alabama, which is the hill country, where they were not interested in secession. Mississippi, places in Mississippi that were more rooted in the economy of the Mississippi than they were joining the Southern plantation owners who were Democrats. And I think one of the issues for you to keep in mind, after the Mexican War, which we referred to before, after 1848, with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, we had the entry of California and Arizona and Nevada and Utah and a part of Wyoming. We had a very, very large increase in the territory of the United States. Southern states, led by Democrat political leaders, were interested in spreading slavery to those states, knowing quite well that their backs were kind of to the political wall, so to speak, against the Union. There was a movement against slavery. The abolitionist sentiment was very strong. The Southerners wanted to equalize the situation or even gain an advantage by allowing slavery to take place inside of this new acquired territory from Mexico. In essence, that's why there was a civil war. Not only that, but the area of Kansas and Nebraska, which had been part of the Louisiana Territory, were also areas where the struggle for slavery was very much going on. And Bleeding Kansas, a struggle between people who were against slavery and people who were for slavery. It caused a mini civil war inside of Kansas. So I'd like you to understand at the outset that not everybody in the South was enthused about this war. But there were enough very rich and powerful planters who understood that their money and their power was rooted in slavery, and it needed to be extended westward. And if somebody like Abraham Lincoln was going to be elected, who had declared his opposition to the spreading of slavery, not to the abolition, but to the spreading of slavery, that was the end of the game as far as the Southern planters were concerned. And this was a cause for making civil war. We have an example of somebody who probably represented the ideas of the Southern planter class more effectively than anyone. His name was Edmund Ruffin. And Edmund Ruffin was given the quote, honor of firing the first shot against Fort Sumter in the American Civil War. And when the Union defeated the Confederacy at the end of the war, shortly thereafter he committed suicide. It was so horrendous in his estimation to tolerate this idea of an ending of slavery, an ending of the Southern way of life, that he just decided, he blew his brains out with a gun. We have a famous photograph of the shelling of Fort Sumter on April the 12th, 1861. There's a lot of detail to mention, and we want to get to the blockade. And what I'll say here, Fort Sumter and Fort Moultrie guard the approaches to Charleston Harbor from the Atlantic Ocean. You needed to have control over those two forts in order to control Charleston Harbor. Now, Sumter was under federal or Union control. And very complicated situation of negotiation. The situation in Charleston was very, very tense and very dangerous. And Lincoln wanted to send a ship down to relieve the people of Fort Sumter, the personnel at Fort Sumter, who needed foodstuffs and other things just to live, and which had been denied them by the city of Charleston. Before this relief expedition could take place, Jefferson Davis thought it was a good idea to order the evacuation of Fort Sumter before this relief ship came, and that would put the South in a stronger moral position that they weren't actually going against a relief expedition. They were defining the sovereignty of the Confederacy that would extend to Fort Sumter and Fort Moultrie. Now, I mentioned to you about the Princeton and the lag in U.S. naval development that we see taking place after that horrific explosion. And now I'd like to introduce to you the man who was going to really change things for the Union Navy, and that was Gideon Welles. Gideon Welles, Abraham Lincoln, who had a great sense of humor, liked to call him Father Neptune. I think it's kind of hilarious that he wore a wig that was one color, and his beard, which was natural, was a white color. So it was a kind of a strange look, but he did have the look of Father Neptune. And anyway, just a little background about Gideon Welles to put him in perspective. Originally, he was a Democrat. His father had been a Jeffersonian Democrat. He came from Connecticut, and his father had played a role in severing all pre-revolutionary ties to Britain in 1818 in a convention. He was going to be a lawyer, but he switched to journalism, became the founder and editor of the Hartford Times. As a Jacksonian Democrat, now essentially what is a Jacksonian Democrat? Jacksonian Democrats supposedly believed in less government, and they certainly did not oppose slavery. They wanted the states to make the decision for that. They kind of rejected the strong central government idea of the Whigs, which was a party that pretty much formed out of the Federalist Party. Lots more to say about that, but James Polk became a candidate in 1844, and there were a lot of people who didn't like Polk, because Polk was a foremost champion of manifest destiny. They thought Polk would get the United States into a lot of trouble by making war with Mexico and creating all sorts of problems with Britain over Oregon. And so some people began to distance themselves from Polk. Gideon Welles decided to align himself with the Free Soil campaign of Martin Van Buren of New York, who had been president. And that made him more comfortable because he was increasingly against slavery. Now, his only naval experience had been as the chief of Naval Bureau of Provisions and Clothing. Now, that may not seem too terribly glamorous, but it was a great opportunity for Gideon Welles to get into the insides of the Naval Department and find out how things ran. His father, by the way, had a very strong maritime past as well, and he knew a lot about ships and knew a lot about the Navy. And he is going to support Lincoln. He's going to join the Republican Party in 1854 when the Republicans get started. And then he's going to back Lincoln in 1860. And as a result of that, Lincoln wanted to select a cabinet that was geographically balanced. And he picked Gideon Welles to represent the sort of Northeast, the New England area. And he knew that Gideon Welles was a very good administrator and a very bright man. And it was a tremendous credit to Lincoln that he was able to spot talent and get somebody like Gideon Welles on board. Now, here's a picture of Winfield Scott in 1861. You can see he's aged considerably. He's overweight. He's got a lot of physical problems. In order to get on his horse, he needs a ladder. and he's not up to any kind of military campaign. But his mind is sharp as a razor, and he's thinking about what the hell are we going to do about these Southerners? How are we going to defeat them? And his idea is the Anaconda Plan that we mentioned before. He introduces this in May of 1861. All right, now, there's a lot of place names that you need to know in order to have an adequate understanding of the blockade. And one of the place names I'd like to introduce you to is Hampton Roads. Hampton Roads, you know, I think the first time I ever heard the term Hampton Roads, I was thinking, why is a body of water called roads? And what's up with that geographical expression? Well, a road is or roadstead is a body of water that is sheltered from tides or ocean swells, where ships can lie reasonably safe at anchor, which will prevent them from dragging or coming loose. It can be open or natural, and it's usually estuary based, and it may be created artificially. All right, so that's what we mean by a road. Now, the name Hampton goes back to the British Hampton Court Palace, and there's certainly a lot of place names that are going to be utilized by Virginia, which is settled by the English. The United States has a major naval base in Norfolk, Virginia. It's actually Portsmouth, Virginia. Right next door. And it's called Gosport. This was the name of the port, and it was very, very important. The name Gosport means a place of geese. There are a number of Gosports in other towns in the world. The fall of Gosport to the Confederacy was a great prize for the Southerners. And it was with the fall of Gosport that they were able to take control. Just before it fell, the Union had decided to set Gosport on fire. And as many things as they could deny the South, they wanted to destroy, including a ship called the USS Merrimack. Now, the Merrimack had been a very powerful ship, and it was set on fire, but it didn't actually burn the hull of the ship. The fire was put out sufficiently to prevent the entire destruction of the ship. And it was from that, what was left of the USS Merrimack, that the Confederates decided to refit that ship and call it the CSS Virginia. Confederate Steamship, Virginia. All right, so when they took over Gosport, I mean, imagine if the San Diego Navy Yard, or the Norfolk Shipyard, as it's called today, was taken over in a civil war. It would be a disaster. And Gosport contained 14 ships, a giant granite dry dock, 2,000 cannons, many of which were very, very well constructed Dahlgren guns, the best guns that were available at the time, 300,000 pounds of gunpowder, and a vast complex of foundries and repair facilities. This is going to be lost. Here's a picture of the refashioning of the USS Merrimack, renamed the Virginia, which it had scuttled. And you see, it's a very tough-looking ship. It's being plated with ironclad. The Dahlgren cannons that have been left at Gosport are now being put into the Merrimack, and it's going to be a very formidable ship. Now, I just introduced you briefly here to Stephen Mallory, who became the Confederate Secretary of State. One of the things that I think is very important to keep in mind about the Confederacy, they really don't have a Navy when the Civil War begins, except for what they were able to scrounge from Gosport. And so you have someone like Stephen Mallory, who is a very, very bright fellow and a very creative person, who is going to recognize that the Confederacy needs to do whatever it possibly can in order to innovate. And innovate the Confederates do. They're eventually going to make torpedoes, which was the present-day name for mines. They were going to build submarines such as the Hunley, and they were going to initiate commerce raiders, which were going to set out to destroy Union shipping and merchant shipping wherever these ships could be found, anywhere in the world. So Mallory, I think one of the things to keep in mind about the Confederacy is because they're facing overwhelming odds. The population of the Union is about 21 million. The Confederacy has 9 million. There's a great deal more industry and manufacturing and resources in the North. And so the Confederacy has to be as innovative as they possibly can. And Stephen Mallory is going to do a very fine job for the Confederacy, given the limits that have been placed on him. Here we have a map of Norfolk, and I'd like you to have a little idea about this. If you've never been to Norfolk, it's a great trip. And there's a facility called Nauticus, which is a wonderful museum. You can visit the USS Wisconsin. And the naval shipyard. Now, you see where Portsmouth is. Portsmouth is where Gosport was located. So even though it's called, when the Union recaptured the facility, they called it the Norfolk Shipyard, but technically it was in Portsmouth. Here's another, this shows you Hampton Roads, and we have a map here. I think a lot of people now, there are Civil War experts that know towns and rivers pretty much like the back of their hand. And but if you're something of a novice to the Civil War, and maybe your knowledge of the geography is somewhat lacking, this map can help you a little bit in understanding Virginia. So you can see Hampton Roads, which leads into the Chesapeake Bay, is really the opening in many ways for the whole of Virginia. The James River, now there are other rivers, the Rappahannock and the Rapidan, but the James River cuts across Virginia and all the way to what Virginians will call Buchanan. If you're not from Virginia, you'll say Buchanan. But it originates in the Shenandoah Valley, the Blue Ridge Mountains. That's actually where my father is from, Roanoke, Virginia. And so as a boy, I had a chance to visit almost all of the Civil War sites. I was a real pest with my dad. Can we go to Chancellorsville on this trip? Can we go to Newmarket this time? I was constantly wanting to visit these battles en route to visiting my family in Roanoke. But the Shenandoah Valley is a very, very fertile area, supplying a great deal of food. And this is the Shenandoah Valley is where Jeb Stuart rode his famous cavalry and had a great deal of control in that part of Virginia. In any event, one of the things I'd like you to know, Richmond, Virginia, right on the James, but access to Richmond was not very easy for the Union. And that's because there was a high bluff 9 miles to the south of Richmond called Drury's Bluff. And Drury's Bluff, the key to river defenses, named for a local landowner, Captain Augustus H. Drury. And the bluffs rose 90 feet above the water and commanded a sharp bend in the James River, making it a logical site for defensive fortifications. On March 17, 1862, the men of Captain Drury's Southside artillery arrived at the bluff and began fortifying the area. They constructed earthworks, erected barracks, dug artillery placements, and mounted 3 large seacoast guns, including one 10-inch Columbiad and 2 8-inch Columbiads in the fort. Now, this made it very hard to conquer Richmond at this stage. As we'll see in a moment, the conquest of a great many ports in the south could be effected. But because of these heights, the Drury Bluff Heights, it was tough at this stage to conquer Richmond. Here's a photograph of Drury's Bluff, showing just how high it is up there. And once those cannons are in place, anybody who tries to sail up the James and get to Richmond, good luck. All right, I'd like to introduce to you Admiral David Dixon Porter, who is going to work closely in the first year, 1861. The Navy is going to conquer quite a number of important ports on their own, without too much Army support. In 1862, there are going to be joint operations between the Army and Navy, and that type of policy will continue right through the end of the war. Porter, kind of a tricky guy. His father was David Porter, the hero of the War of 1812, and his Porter actually adopted Admiral Farragut, David Glasgow Farragut, who became Porter's half-brother. Now, the two of them got along okay, but it's been known that Porter was a little bit on the tricky side and would sometimes work to undermine Farragut in the ideas of, in the mind of Gideon Welles. Fortunately, Gideon Welles could often see beyond this sort of political stuff that was going on. Porter, certainly according to Ulysses Grant, was an excellent naval man and a tremendous help to him on a number of campaigns, including Vicksburg. All right, now one of the first major operations that's going to take place in the wake of the disastrous defeat at Bull Run or Manassas. The Southerners like to call battles after towns, and the Union tended to call them after rivers or creeks. So Bull Run was a creek, and the Union refers to it as Bull Run. And General Irwin McDowell, who never had any real field experience, but he had trained, studied the military in France, he is totally outmaneuvered by Thomas Stonewall Jackson. And the Battle of Manassas is going to be a complete rout for the Union. The Union troops will retreat 25 miles back to Washington, D.C., and it looks like a terrible, terrible situation for the Union at that stage. We tend to think, those of you who do think about the Civil War, we tend to think that 1861 was just a series of disasters for the Union, that nothing was really going well, and that sort of continues on in 1862. But we're not including the Navy. You know, the Navy personnel was only 5% of the total personnel that fought in the American Civil War. And yet they play an inordinate percentage of importance in victories against the Confederacy. So Cape Hatteras is a very, very important waterway, and Pamlico Sound, which together, both Cape Hatteras and Pamlico Sound, control a great deal of the fishing that's in North Carolina. And so from fishing alone, we find that the conquest of Hatteras is going to deprive North Carolina and the rest of the Confederacy a great deal of foodstuffs. And you can see the rivers that connect into North Carolina, the Neuse and the Tar River. And so by conquering Hatteras, you are going to have an area where the Confederates cannot build or at least launch raiders, commerce raiders, that are going to destroy the Union fleet and merchant fleet. And so it's a tremendous victory for the Union, and one that is often forgotten. Now this summer, stay tuned, because we're going to have a presentation by Kevin P. Duffus, and it's called The Lost Light of Cape Hatteras. Cape Hatteras had a first order Fresnel lens, one of the most beautiful lenses in the United States. And the Confederacy managed to take it away before the Union got control of Cape Hatteras light. Now, for well over a century, there was a mystery what happened to that beautiful light. And Kevin P. Duffus is eventually going to, in an absolutely masterly work, he's going to solve the issue of what happened to Cape Hatteras light. I'm not going to tell you. Today is May the 7th, 2020. He'll be here on our Lighthouse Keeper weekend for our gala, and he'll speak on the Saturday, and he'll tell us all about what happened to that light. So keep that one in mind. In addition to Cape Hatteras, we have a great many islands that are known as the Sea Islands. Now they are located in South Carolina and Georgia and even parts of northern Florida. Now, in my first year of Oxford, I had the privilege to, I started out doing American and British history in my first year, and I had the privilege of studying with a woman by the name of Willie Lee Rose, and this is her book. And it was a great book, a very famous book at the time, Rehearsal for Reconstruction, the Port Royal Experiment. And I learned a great deal about Port Royal and what happened, and General Sherman issued an order that gave land to the freed blacks and 40 acres and a mule, and the people of the Sea Islands were in a very advantageous position. It's a fascinating story. Let me just back up here. The Sea Islands were unbelievably important in an economic sense to the South. On November 7, 1861, following delays due to stormy weather, the Union fleet under the command of Flag Officer Samuel Francis DuPont. Now he's from the DuPont family, very rich, very privileged man. DuPont Circle in Washington is named after Samuel Francis DuPont. His statue used to be there, and then it was taken down by order of the family and moved to Wilmington, Delaware. Anyway, the DuPont bombarded Fort Walker and Fort Beauregard, eventually took control of both installations with a loss of only 8 men and 11 on shore. Port Royal Harbor was the deepest on the eastern Atlantic, I should say the southern eastern Atlantic. And the capture of the Sea Islands deprived the South the great wealth and benefit of cotton, rice, and indigo. So now the blockade is going to extend. We're going to be looking in more detail about the conflict between the Monitor and the Merrimack. That's coming up in 1862, and we're still in 1861. So at this stage, I'd like you to keep in mind that the United States has taken over Cape Hatteras. They've taken over the Sea Islands. In Georgia, islands like Jekyll Island, where the Federal Reserve was first established, Edisto Island, lots of beautiful islands, Hilton Head, which is a big golf resort today, and Port Royal, which was the prize port of the Sea Islands. And one of the things that I can't resist not mentioning to you, the really wonderful personalities of the people down there. A lot of these people are believed to have descended from Sierra Leone. They speak a language of their own called Gula. And they have their own arts and crafts. They have their own expressions and language. And one of the accounts that I read about the Sea Island people is because they were located off the coast, and so many of the plantation owners didn't want to actually live where those slaves were working on the plantations, because there was a lot of malarial conditions and everything else. It wasn't safe. So they tended to have, these people tended to have free reign. And they weren't under that kind of control that you find in other plantations. Consequently, to this day, these folks feel much more independent. They're wealthier. The statistics for them across the board tend to be much better than other people in the United States, African American population in the United States, because of their geographical conditions and because of Sherman's order to give them land and a mule. All right, continuing on down along the coast, we've got 3,000 miles to cover. I'm not going to mention every single little town, but we've got some important places to include. So as we go down now to Georgia, here's the border between South Carolina and Georgia. We have Cockspur Island, and that's where Fort Pulaski is located. Fort Pulaski is one of those major forts that was constructed primarily in response to the War of 1812. We had a tremendous fort building program that took place right here in Staten Island, not far from the museum. We have Fort Wadsworth on the Staten Island side, and Fort Hamilton. And those forts were built because of the War of 1812. Even though New York City was never attacked during that war, Washington and Baltimore were. The Star-Spangled Banner was written as a result of the attack against Fort McHenry. So a great many forts were built during that period in order to fortify, pretty much with the idea of protecting themselves against the British, but against any possible hostile power. Here's Fort Pulaski guarding Savannah. So Savannah itself is not conquered, but the approaches to Savannah are conquered, which is going to be extremely helpful for the Union, because Confederate raiders could possibly be built in the Savannah Harbor, but you're not going to be able to get them out if the Union fleet is in control of the passages that allow you to enter the Atlantic Ocean. So Savannah is going to be fairly well bottled up. Now, as we move down to the coast to Florida, we see that Jacksonville has a very, very important role to play, because Jacksonville is the St. Johns River runs through Jacksonville, and this is going to become a major economic point for the Confederacy. Jacksonville, I have a very good friend who moved down to Jacksonville, actually built a house down in Jacksonville, and it's very close to the St. Johns River. And he's been telling me about these beautiful boat rides that he takes and gets off at various towns along the way to enjoy. If he wants to go to dinner, hops on the boat, goes down the St. Johns River to one or another port, and enjoys a beautiful dinner. Now, most people who go to Florida today, they go to Miami, Fort Lauderdale, Palm Beach, or they go to the West Coast, or of course Orlando. And I don't think that people visit Jacksonville and St. Johns River as much. So it's really an area that was very important during the 19th century, but lost a bit of its economic vitality in the 20th century. So Jacksonville itself had to be conquered. Now, in order to conquer Jacksonville, it's a good idea to control the St. John's Bluffs that are south of Jacksonville. And so in our next slide here, we see a picture of St. John's. The Battle of St. John's Bluff in Jacksonville, 18 miles south of the city, October 1st through the 3rd, 1862. And this victory will eventually help the Union control the entire area of Jacksonville. But now I want you to keep in mind, even before this is conquered, because we're still in 1861, that these coastal areas such as the Cape Hatteras and Sea Islands are under the control of the Union. And it's from these points that they're going to be able to launch their attacks against Confederate ports that lay further west. It's a little bit like the island hopping idea for the United States in the Pacific Theater during World War II. The way to get to the Japanese mainland is from island to island to island, and then you're going to conquer the mainland. So the idea that General Scott has in May of 1861 is a very clear idea. Just the way he conquered Veracruz and then made his way into Mexico City with great help from the Army Corps of Engineers, and in particular Robert E. Lee. It was a magnificent campaign, and the generals who fought in the Mexican campaign remembered what happened in Mexico very, very clearly and wanted to apply the same thing to the Confederacy. So keep in mind Jacksonville and St. John's River, and you have in our next slide here, we have a picture from the heights of St. John's Bluff, and showing you the tremendous height. And here's a picture of downtown Jacksonville today, showing the St. John's River. You can see some very attractive bridges that have been built. And here's a sort of a travel photo, because taking boat cruises on the St. John's River was quite a popular thing in the 19th and 20th century, probably up until the middle of the 20th century. So here's St. John's River near Willaca, and it's very picturesque, very kind of slow moving, very southern. You know, today we think of Florida as being almost an extension of, or at least parts of it, as an extension of New York. And but here, when you look at the St. John's River, it's really that image of the deep South. Slow, lazy days with beautiful, beautiful scenery and a very kind of wonderful approach to nature. Now, our next slide shows this is Fort Jefferson, and this is in the island of Dry Tortugas. Dry Tortugas. Now, Tortugas in Spanish means turtles, and when Ponce de Leon first saw this island, he called it the Island of the Turtles. And then the name evolved into Dry Tortugas because it didn't have its own water supply. If you remember, the Ponce de Leon was always looking for a fountain of youth, and he wasn't going to find that in Dry Tortugas, in Tortugas. So that's why it got the name Dry Tortugas. Well, if you want to visit Dry Tortugas, go to Key West, which I did about, 25 years ago, and take a boat. It's 70 miles west of Key West, and you'll see this magnificent Fort Jefferson, which actually was never completed, as a lot of forts were not completed along the coast of the Atlantic. And but it is a very, very beautiful facility. Winfield Scott wanted to make sure that it was maintained under Union control. There was no particular battle that took place. Control remained under the Union. And I like to mention to you that many of you have probably heard of Dr. Samuel Mudd, who fixed the leg of John Wilkes Booth after he assassinated Abraham Lincoln. And the jury continues to be out whether or not Mudd knew that John Wilkes Booth was John Wilkes Booth. Remember, they didn't have communication at that time the way we have it now. Now we can pick up our iPhone and get the news instantly. But sometimes it took days and days to get information. Anyway, he set the leg of Booth when Booth jumped onto the stage shouting "Sic Semper Tyrannis," thus to all tyrants, the motto of Virginia, and killed Lincoln. And then he made his way down. One of the most interesting things I've ever done is I took an all-day Booth escape tour that starts from the Surratt House and ends up at the very place where Booth was killed. And it's an all day, 7:30 AM to PM. And you see every stop along the way, including the house of Dr. Samuel Mudd. Well, for all that, I wanted to mention to you that after he was imprisoned, well, Mudd was imprisoned in Fort Jefferson. And his behavior was exemplary, and it was because of that that he was released. And even though his name, I'll risk, his name was still Mudd, I risk saying that, but, and continues to be Roger Mudd, the newscaster, is a descendant of Dr. Samuel Mudd. In any event, this is right near the cell where Samuel Mudd spent his time in prison. Pretty isolated place, sort of the Devil's Island of the United States. And here's a little closer look at the brickwork of these forts is magnificent. Philip Sheridan, the great cavalry leader for the Union, visited Fort Wadsworth right near our museum here back in the 1870s, and he thought that the brickwork of Fort Wadsworth was the most beautiful he had ever seen. But remember, a lot of the same architects who built Fort Wadsworth also built forts like Jefferson and Fort Morgan in Mobile Bay, and so it was a magnificent effort to defend the coast. Now we have somebody that's a little close to my heart, because I live in the Bay Ridge section of Brooklyn and very close to Fort Hamilton Army Base, and there's a real interest in ordnance in Bay Ridge. So you have streets like Dahlgren Place and Gatling Place, and the names of famous inventors of particular weapons. So I don't live terribly far from Dahlgren Place. Parrott Place, which has nothing to do with the bird parrot, but has everything to do with the Parrott gun that had a lot of difficulties. It used to explode a lot in the course of firing it. But any discussion of the Union blockade would be incomplete without mentioning Rear Admiral John Dahlgren, who established the Department of Ordnance for the U.S. Navy, and he was an inventor of the Dahlgren gun. Dahlgren becomes a key figure because his guns gave the Union a tremendous edge. Even though the Confederacy was able to capture some of the Dahlgren guns, Dahlgren himself kept making improvements on guns and fitted them onto Union vessels, which had great success against Confederate ships. Here's a picture of a Dahlgren gun on the USS Kearsarge. Now, it was the Kearsarge that eventually defeated the famous CSS Alabama, which we'll be talking about in a little bit. But Alabama, which wreaked more havoc on the Union merchant vessels than any other Confederate raider. And it was eventually destroyed by the USS Kearsarge. And you see one of the guns that took care of the Alabama near the city of Cherbourg in France. One of the major responses for the Confederacy to this astounding degree of shipbuilding that was being conducted under the direction of Gideon Welles, Naval Secretary, well, the Confederacy had to respond. They didn't have the iron resources. They didn't have the industrial capacity of the Union. But they did have plants that could fashion cannons. But what they did in order to try to attain some sort of parity with the Union, which of course they never achieved, was to build what were called torpedoes. We call them mines today, but the common name for a mine back then was torpedo. And they established the Confederate commerce raiders. Now, who were these commerce raiders? Well, they were, if you know the story of Gone with the Wind and Rhett Butler, he was a captain on one of these ships. That's how he got so rich. That's how he was able to give Scarlett O'Hara all those nice hats that he'd bring back, and all that nice finery from Charleston would be acquired because Rhett Butler was a commerce raider, paid a very handsome wage for doing that. These were very respected people because they provided the lifeline for the Confederacy. If goods weren't able to reach the ports, it was going to be an enormous problem for the Confederacy. Now, one point that I'd like to make here, which I think is of tremendous significance, nobody should think that these ships were all lined up and preventing the Confederate commerce from taking place. That was impossible. Some of these ships could be miles from each other. So what did they do? Well, they prevented a lot of ships from going in and out of the ports. And I think a major point to keep in mind is while they didn't get all the ships, think of how many never even made the effort because they were afraid of the Union blockade. But there were these daring people in the Confederacy who would run the blockade because the ships that they sailed were often faster. They had ramming devices. They had a smaller number of cannons. They would attack at night very often. They were fast ships, sneaky ships, and they provided sometimes some of the supplies that the Southerners needed. So what we're looking at here is another Florida base, this is the city of Pensacola, which is in the western part of Florida, has Fort Pickens. And Fort Pickens is also going to remain under Union control. It's a magnificent fort. And as you can see from this map, it's very, very difficult to imagine getting into Pensacola without getting past this entry point, which is very narrow, and Fort Pickens, very, very well fortified, will just blast any ship out of the water. So the Union got control of Pensacola. That's going to be another base from which they can attack further southern ports heading out west. Now, back to this Confederate raider. This is the most famous of the Confederate raider captains, Raphael Semmes, 1807 to 1877. He was a commander of the CSS Sumter and the famous CSS Alabama, the most successful Confederate commerce raider of the Civil War. And he was something of a Confederate national hero for his accomplishments in getting supplies into the Confederacy. Now, no discussion of the blockade is really complete without a discussion of the Trent Affair. And here we have Rear Admiral Charles Wilkes, and commander of the USS San Jacinto, that set out to find the CSS Sumter. And in Bermuda, while staying in Bermuda, Wilkes found out that two men, Mason and Slidell, were going to head to Britain and France in order to try to negotiate a deal with the British and the French to gain support for the Confederate cause. Wilkes took it upon himself to attack the vessel known as the Trent, and he arrested Mason and Slidell, and they were brought to prison. James Murray Mason and John Slidell were bound for Britain on board the British RMS Trent. He ordered the USS San Jacinto to intercept and board RMS Trent, and they were eventually taken to Fort Warren in Boston. Congress expressed appreciation to Wilkes, but Lincoln, seeking to avoid war with Britain, wisely disavowed the action, and he was subsequently assigned to blockade duty in the West Indies. Wilkes, by the way, was very unpopular with other members of the Navy, and he had been on a mission that took place in 1836, and it was known as the Exploring Mission. Wilkes had been all over the world and pretty much saw every place that one could imagine. And when he was in the Fiji Islands, he ordered the slaughter of 80 people in retribution for the murder of his nephew. He constantly clashed with Gideon Welles. Gideon Welles and Lincoln understood, yeah, maybe it's a good idea to capture Mason and Slidell, but we don't want to have a war with Britain and France. We have enough on our hands with the Confederacy. So the only wise decision was to let this go. So eventually these men were released. And the crisis, and here on the a depiction of the Trent Affair, and in this next slide we see Slidell on the left and Mason, who was the envoy to France. So these two men were released, and they continued to offer their diplomatic efforts on behalf of establishing some sort of tie between the French and the British, but it was never going to happen.